Hi, my name is Rowan Hildebrand-Chupp. I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego in sociology and science studies. My talk is titled When the Diagnosis is the Problem, a comparative historical approach to the medical devaluation of same-sex sexuality and fatness. So Rachel has already gone through the basics of the medical devaluation model of stigma. In the next two talks, we're going to be applying this model and showing how it operates in different contexts. So in particular, as a historical sociologist of medicine, I'm going to be talking about the more sociological aspects of the model. That is, how medical claims, the circulation of devaluing medical claims leads individuals to take stigmatizing actions, especially at the structural level. So my main argument is that there are a lot of striking similarities between medicine's historical role in stigma against gay people and its role in stigma against fat people today. Although psychiatrists in the middle of the 20th century asserted that a medical approach to homosexuality would be more humane and less punitive, medical claims were instead used selectively to develop and justify more discriminatory government policies. So among gay activists that emerged after these policies and sort of the aftermath of these policies, these activists were able to effectively push for demedicalization by criticizing their own medical devaluation. In contrast, weight stigma research has portrayed causal attributions as the source of weight stigma, which has made it harder for fat activists to fight medicalization and fat oppression. So this is part of an ongoing research project. Here is the range of the kinds of historical sources that I'm using, primary and secondary. I'm not going to go into details in terms of using particular quotes from primary source documents. I'm really trying to give the big picture today. So this is going to be a very condensed sort of historical story. But I do want to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of documents that I'm drawing on. So between the 1930s and the 1950s, psychiatric claims about homosexuality as an arrested form of psychosexual development and a mental illness became circulated widely. And in part as an effect of this, a moral panic emerged around the homosexual menace, especially in the early 1950s. In combination with this, state and federal governments started creating new kinds of discriminatory policies that use psychiatric concepts and justifications to legitimize and construct new ways of oppressing gay people. And as part of this, gay people became deeply culturally devalued in a profound and prominent way that simply wasn't the case at the beginning of the 20th century. In a very similar way, at the end of the 20th century, medical claims about obesity and health risks became circulated widely. And this led to a moral panic over the obesity epidemic. And as a result of this moral panic, fat people became more culturally devalued in a very prominent way. So I think there's a lot of parallels between the effects of the circulation of medical claims in these two cases. There are also a lot of very striking similarities between the kinds of claims that both psychiatrists in the mid-20th century and figures in mainstream weight stigma discourse make in terms of claiming both a medical approach as superior while also trying to disavow the stigma against either homosexuals or people with obesity, as they're called. So in both of these communities, a medical approach is portrayed as more scientific, and it's claimed that it will lead to a more sympathetic societal response. And both of these discourses really focus on this idea of not holding either homosexuals or people with obesity as morally responsible for their way of being. So rather than valuing that way of being as a form of valuable diversity, they really emphasize not blaming them or not engaging in punitive policies. One of the most striking similarities between these two sort of communities was a particular use of causal theories to create seemingly sympathetic claims against stigma. So in the mid-20th century, psychiatrists really emphasized this idea that negative societal attitudes towards homosexuality could cause sexual repression, which could in turn cause homosexuality. Similarly, there's a bunch of weight stigma research that's argued that weight stigma causes unhealthy habits, which in turn causes obesity. What's striking about these claims is that they both, on their surface, seem to be sympathetic, right? In that they imply that if we just weren't so harsh towards this group of people, the problem would go away on its own. But ultimately, both of them still rely on a focus on prevention as the utmost goal, right? So in the case of the psychiatrists, they really emphasize this idea that preventing homosexuality was the best course of action, rather than trying to punish individual homosexuals. And similarly, in weight stigma discourse, especially in the mainstream or among medical professionals and medical organizations, there's this focus on preventing obesity at the structural level, rather than punishing people with obesity, as they're called, at the individual level. So there are very striking similarities between these two sets of ideas. However, the most important thing for you to know is that although these psychiatrists believe that a medical approach would be more humane and less stigmatizing, they were simply wrong. Instead, medicalization enabled the development of more stigmatizing policies. It basically backfired. And there are a lot of different cases where you can see that this played out in this way. I'm going to pick one and talk about that in detail, just to kind of flesh it out a little bit. So in particular, before World War II, soldiers that were caught in same-sex acts were occasionally court-martialed for sodomy. And they could be imprisoned for 20 plus years. So psychiatrists in the military at the start of World War II saw this and argued that homosexuals should be discharged from the military instead. And they argued that this approach would be, like I said, more humane, more scientific, arguing that because gay people were ill, that they wouldn't respond towards punitive policies. They wouldn't actually change their behavior. What ended up happening is the Army did adopt a policy that used medical language to enable military officers to use both approaches. So psychiatrists were able to have an effect, but rather than replacing one set of policies for another, what ended up happening is that military officers used both of them to the same effect, which is to exclude gay people. So for example, a military officer could use the threat of a court-martial to coerce and browbeat someone who is accused of being gay into signing a document that would discharge them from the military. So as a result, although the number of court-martials did decline slightly, thousands of gay people were discharged from the military for being gay during World War II. And this had really serious negative consequences. In particular, the VA ended up determining that the people with these less than honorable discharges were not eligible for benefits through the GI Bill. And these people found that these blue discharges were so stigmatized that they made it harder for them to get a job, and within a few years, impossible to get a security clearance. So it had incredibly destructive effects for gay people, and it massively expanded the anti-homosexual apparatus of the United States military. And psychiatrists that were involved in developing this policy actually ended up turning against it at the end of World War II and in the years immediately after. But by then it was too late because the policy had been created. And as you may know, this policy persisted for many decades, leading tens and hundreds of thousands of gay people to be excluded from the military for being gay. So the end result here is that you see the devaluing claims, the devaluing aspect of a medical approach, the idea that homosexuality is bad and needs to be excluded, that part gets taken up by other actors, bureaucrats, military officials. But the aspects of a medical approach that were in any way less stigmatizing were sort of left by the wayside. And so at every point you see that even though for psychiatrists, they might have, sought a less stigmatizing approach, inevitably the opposite happened. So as you can imagine, these policies that were created in the mid-20th century in the United States ended up leading directly to the emergence of the gay rights movement in the 1950s. And by the 1960s, lesbian and gay activists were critiquing medical devaluation as the source of stigma. They were directly linking medicine with their oppression by the hands of the state. And so in the early 1970s, lesbian and gay activists engaged in a campaign against the American Psychiatric Association to contest this medical devaluation and to push back against the idea that being gay is a mental illness. And in the end, they were successful. The APA removed homosexuality from the DSM. and they declared strong support for gay civil rights protection. And as I'll mention in a moment, these claims about the role of medicine in their oppression were incredibly crucial. And there's a lot of similarities here with the case of struggles to demedicalize fatness, in that fat activists have for many decades criticized medical devaluation as a source of stigma. They've talked about how medicine, the diet industry, doctors are very influential in terms of upholding the oppression of fat people. However, starting in the 1990s, weight stigma researchers asserted instead that it was causal attributions that were the source of weight stigma. And so by the 2010s, various medical organizations were able to adopt resolutions against weight stigma while doubling down on a medical approach. And these resolutions and consensus statements almost exclusively cite weight stigma research that relies on attribution theory, rather than citing research that draws on ideas from fat activism and fat studies. So, in other words, whereas gay activists were successful because they focused on the source of oppression as the problem, weight stigma researchers and medical organizations focus on the causal explanations for the existence of the group itself as the problem. And in this way, I think it's important to understand that when you focus on causal attribution, what ends up happening is, rather than actually, you're not just, in other words, using an epistemically limited paradigm, as Rachel talked about in the previous talk. You're not just refraining from criticizing the idea that fat people are bad and shouldn't exist. You're also distracting from the ultimate underlying structural sources of stigma and making it harder for fat activists to push back against that stigma and to push for demedicalization, to push for destigmatization. So in the early 1970s, there were a number of arguments that gay activists used that were very effective in achieving demedicalization. So one was they asserted the value of same-sex sexuality. So one of the most important slogans of the time was gay is good. They didn't just say gay is not bad. They said gay is good, right? And also that they really, as I mentioned, they explicitly linked psychiatry to the oppression they were experiencing, including talking about how being told that they were mentally ill led to low self-esteem and self-blame in response to oppressive systems. So in other words, the psychological problems that were associated with being gay, they said were mediated by their oppression, including their oppression at the hands of psychiatry. They also asserted that same-sex sexuality was not necessarily associated with other kinds of undesirable characteristics like psychological problems, an inability to function more broadly, or like a deep sadness. That basically being gay didn't necessarily mean that you had these other negative characteristics. So what are the implications for fighting weight stigma? I mean, I think the most obvious one, and sort of reiterating Rachel's point, is that intensifying the medicalization of fatness will intensify weight stigma, not stop it. Despite what Novo Nordisk might want you to believe in their millions of dollars they've spent on advertising that claims that discovering the health condition will stop the stigma, the solution to fat oppression cannot possibly be to get rid of fat people. That these are mutually exclusive goals that will always be contradictory and that will never be able to be achieved at the same time. So as a result, eliminating weight stigma requires both pushing for demedicalization and valuing fat people. In other words, if medical devaluation is the problem, then pushing for demedicalization and valuing fat people is the solution. Even though I've been harsh on weight stigma research, when you look at this comparison and think about the historical difference, I do think that weight stigma research can aid the fight for demedicalization if it divests from attribution theory focused approaches. In particular, if you look at the mid-1950s, the link between medicine and anti-gay government policies was very blatant. The policies used explicitly medical language, and therefore the sort of link between them was very hard for psychiatrists to deny. In contrast, the way that medicine produces weight stigma in the 21st century is harder to trace, right? It doesn't operate through explicitly discriminatory policies against fat people most of the time. Instead, it operates through a more diffuse cultural influence through the circulation of these claims in the media and all the other aspects of this medical devaluation model that we've proposed. And as a result of this more diffused effect, I think that social psychological research into the social cognitive mechanisms of medical devaluation could really fill the gap. That is, by studying at the individual level how thinking of fatness as a disease, as pathological, leads people to devalue fat people, that could really help provide ammunition for the push to demedicalize. And in that regard, I think it could really make a difference. Thank you, and here's my works cited. Thank you for your time.